Hello and welcome to our ethics lecture for November 3rd. I'm glad you're here with us. I'm Andrew Fiala. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at Fresno State and a professor of philosophy. And you're here to listen to Charlie Harvey talk about the title of the talk, Insatiable, Why Everything is Not Enough. I'll introduce Dr. Harvey in just a second, but just begin by saying thank you to everyone who helps to make this kind of thing possible. Our Fresno State Alumni Association that runs the Zoom, and Eduardo Tovar, my student assistant. We've been doing these lectures now. I think this could be the 15th year of our ethics lecture series, and we do 4 or 5 events every semester. And the idea is to promote critical thinking and to get students in the community to think about topics related to ethics broadly construed. Just a kind of heads up about upcoming events. Our next lecture will be on November 10th. That's next week, a week from today. That'll be an ethical leadership lecture by Dr. Paul Binion, who is a leader on the west side of town here in Fresno. And then on December 10th, the end of the year, end of our series this year, we'll have a Human Rights Day event that will focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So now it's my honor to introduce my friend, Charlie Harvey, Dr. Harvey, who I think I've known for could be 25 years since I started attending this conference of philosophy in the contemporary world. And Charlie was one of the founding figures in that particular group of philosophers. He is a retired professor from the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Central Arkansas. And he's published a couple of books. One has the nice title, Conundrums. It's a book of philosophical questions. And he's written more than 40 articles on issues in phenomenology, existentialism, social criticism, theories of identity and the self. And one important essay, I think a really great essay that he published, was called Making Hollow Men, where he talks about how bureaucracy and academia hollows out our souls. That was an eye-opening essay. And then 2 more recent essays, one called Human Unkind and the Rape of the World, and then an essay that I think is the basis of the talk tonight, Insatiable, Why Everything's Not Enough. So, Charlie, it's been a pleasure knowing you over the years. I'm glad we can have you talk on our lecture series. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Andy. The pleasure is mine as well. I feel honored to be on screen here. So, thanks for attending, folks. And let me start by talking about basically about the structure of the essay. And there'll be an introduction. But the way it's structured is in 4 parts. And the first part is I will be talking about historical philosophers, in particular, St. Augustine. But what I want to get to here is the idea of the empty soul. Even long before bureaucracy emptied us out, humans felt a kind of emptiness. And they continually search for something. And I think St. Augustine is the first one to get this in the West, to get a beautiful description of this. And of course, the Buddha preceded him, and he did so as well. So I want to talk about that, then and how that leads to the frenzied life that in our day has led to the life of frenzied consumption. From that, I want to jump into the 20th century and the 21st and give it all that an evolutionary update in terms of the structure of the brain, and especially the cerebrum, and why maybe we humans experience this emptiness and this yearning to really consume everything we encounter just about. From there, I'll talk about psychology and anthropology and the way in which those disciplines have helped us to understand how the world for us, in a way, is a sign or symbol, and what happens with that in the world of consumption. And finally, in the 4th section, I'll go back to the idea of emptiness. I'll talk about the plasticity of the brain, and then talk about the sacred canopies of culture. And what that refers to is the meaning-giving systems of the various cultures, coming from Peter Berger. And I used to have a conclusion that was kind of a solution, but it was an utter failure in my mind. So I got rid of that. And instead, we're going to just ask, is there a way out of this? Okay, apart from global collapse, collapse of all of our economies, the economies in the world. So here we go. I want to talk first about the first great migration of human beings around the world. So we're starting really early, 70,000 to 12,000 BCE. And what happened at that time is Homo sapiens emerged out of Africa into Southern Europe, what we now call Spain. And groups of these Homo sapiens went east, and they encountered Neanderthals, and other groups went west, and they eventually encountered Denisovan. During this period, from 70,000 to 12,000 BC, our species, Homo sapiens, covered the world. It ended up in 12,000 BCE in southern South America. We call that now Rio de Janeiro. But what's fascinating about this, the way archaeologists best understand where Homo sapiens were and when is by the trail of destruction that they left behind them. That is, they left behind them species devastation and extinction. And so the megafauna, one of the best ways of dating where Homo sapiens were and when is by looking at the megafauna, the large creatures that ceased to exist. And I think that is relevant to the problem that I'm trying to have us think about, and that is excess consumption. Because of this, the incredibly cynical but insightful and brilliant economist John Gray prefers that instead of, whenever he talks about Homo sapiens, or if we talk about Homo sapiens and get a little too uppity and proud of ourselves, he likes to remind us that an equally adequate name would be Homo rapiens. And he doesn't mean by that just the sexual act of rape, but the raping of the world, the raping of the other species that we encounter on our journey around the planet. And so what I want to suggest here is that the first great migration of our species, Homo sapiens, around the world was actually the first great consumption spree of our species as well. And part of why I think my thesis here is important in the field of consumer studies is because in consumer studies, there's multiple claims about when the problem of excess consumption started. And Frank Treneman, in his great book, The Empire of Things, argues that, right back to the 15th century. Others argue that it was with the birth of cottage industries in England and Europe, 17th centuries, 18th century. Most people see the big problem starting in the 19th century with the birth of industrialism and mass production. And some see the real takeoff, the one that we're in now, starting after World War II. Now, I don't have a problem with any of these dates, and I think all these writers give good reasons for locating the dates of excess consumption where they do. But what I want to suggest in this paper is that there's something about us, something about we human beings that puts the problem, the proclivity to consume in outsized ways, to what's that word, to outpunch ourselves, to punch beyond our weight, existed right at the beginning. And maybe it was only till the 19th century that we started gobbling up the world, but the proclivity to do so antedated that by a long, long time. So we have to say right off the bat that consumption is natural. It's required by animal life. But the question that plagues consumer studies is, why do humans consume so much? Why, given an accommodating environment, does human consumption exponentially exceed our animal needs, having, it seems, no upper limit? And part of what I would like to do in this presentation is try to explain at least why I think there is no upper limit for humans in terms of consumption. And why we're insatiable, and why everything is not enough. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think we're in trouble because of it. So as I go along, we'll have kind of a chronological order, but we'll be searching for the deep roots of the problem. Augustine will be the philosopher I talk about most at the beginning, but there's others, Buddha, Pascal, Schopenhauer, Sartre, Ernest Becker, and in our own time, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist. And one thing they all have in common is they all recognize the emptiness of human awareness. And I think that's going to be the key behind what Augustine will call our frenzied existence. So a couple minutes on St. Augustine. Augustine, in thinking about the human being and observing our behavior, observing his own behavior, noticed, he argued that, well, back up slightly, that humans are frenzied. They're frenzied. They're constantly in pursuit of one thing or another. Their desires, he already realized, seem endless. And he wondered why, what's going on here? In himself, he wondered this in his great work, The Confessions. And his answer was that human beings have upon them the mark of the infinite. That is, God, in his mind, rests upon our souls the notion of the infinite, or the real infinite, whatever that may be. And because we're finite beings in this world, and our world's finite, but we have in our souls a notion of the infinite, we exist in a condition of incompleteness. And it's not just random incompleteness, it's essential incompleteness. And for him, there's only one way out. So human beings, in a sense, are in almost a crazed search for fulfillment to figure out who they are or what they're here for. And this is because of the mark of the infinite being upon our souls. Now, Augustine, in my mind, gave one of the first and most brilliant definitions of love. Now, it's no accident that he did this, because Jesus, in one sense, was his teacher and saint, or more. And what Augustine said love is, just kind of quickly, he said that what love is the human soul has this condition of emptiness. The mind, we would say now, it reaches outside of itself. There's three parts here. It reaches outside of itself, tries to make contact with something other than itself, something that it loves, and then bring that thing back to itself to achieve wholeness or unity. Okay, these days philosophers would call this intentionality, but Augustine didn't have that concept, but that's what he's talking about, making contact with the things we love to become whole. Now, for Augustine, there's four possible types of objects we can love: things, oneself, others, and God. What Augustine believed is most of us, again, he didn't use this word, but that we were pathologically insane, almost, at least bordering on that. And the reason we were, just imagine that we have within ourselves our little finite broken bodies, and we have a touch of the infinite, and we're trying to fill that up. Well, how are we going to do that in a finite world? Well, first, one thing people do is they try to reach fulfillment by having things, by having objects. But Augustine was very clear: no mere material object can complete your essential incompleteness. And you all know this. This is perfect for our times. You buy a new car. Oh, that's going to make me who I am. And then it gets not, it gets crashed or totaled, or in a month it's not so cool anymore. You're looking for something else. Things are never enough. The way to think about it is a finite object can't fill an infinite hole. Okay, it's as if we've got an Olympic-sized swimming pool with a hole in the bottom, and you're trying to fill it up with thimbles of water. Not going to happen. Another thing a person can love, is themselves, and they should love themselves. But today, we know what Augustine was talking about. It's called narcissism. It's called this almost obsessive love with oneself, in which the person constantly lives in a process of objectifying him or herself to try to make himself or herself an object for themselves and others. And Augustine already saw, think of TikTok, think of Instagram, think of Facebook. And Augustine already saw that what this did is it left the self bereft of itself. For one thing, you never knew what other people thought of you. You never knew what they saw, etc. So once again, just like we'd use up things, we'd use up other people. And the result of this every time was this frenzied searching for fulfillment. So likewise with others, others that we love and care for. All these things are important, but you have to have them in balance. You have to have them in order, and others can die, others can deceive, others can leave. And so none of these are going to fulfill us. For Augustine, the only hope was loving the infinite object and having it love you back. Now, only then can your love escape its pathological condition. Only if these things are in the right order. So mind you, Augustine was not an ascetic. He liked things, he liked himself at times, he liked others, but you have to have those things in the proper order. And don't dismiss him just because he ended up being a saint. As a young man, he was pretty wild. And one story about him, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but one prayer that's attributed to the good saint is, as a relatively young man, he prayed, "Lord, please make me chaste, just not quite yet." So it's not, so don't dismiss the guy. He knew what he was up to existentially. Okay, and that's what emptiness is, and disordered love, infinite yearning, evolutionary update. So I won't go too far into this, but what I think Augustine was absolutely brilliant in his descriptions of the human condition. And description is different from explanation, but his explanation was the one I just told you about. He saw that we existed in this frenzied state of never being satisfied. And then he gave an explanation of it. And that explanation is in terms of his theology. And frankly, I think it's absolutely brilliant as for the time when he was living. And it might be perfectly brilliant now for many people. But it's also the case that in today's world, his explanatory structure, his theology might not work for a lot of people. And in one way, it's okay if it does or doesn't, because in this case, we can have the scientific explanation and a theological explanation, and I won't give arguments how, but they don't necessarily eliminate one another. Today, I would argue that the source of our problem of endless yearning, infinite pursuit, it's found in the crystal ball that's in our head, called our brain, and in particular called our cerebrum. Just to give you a slightly better picture of what's below, the cerebrum is, in particular, the frontal lobe of the brain is really important for Homo sapiens and deadly perhaps for the world. But I call that a crystal ball because, so within the temporal lobe, I think it's in the temporal, we have the part of the brain that makes us live in the future as much as and more than living in the present. And the fact that by living in the future, what humans do, what Homo sapiens do, is they, we can even be in a state of torture. We're always planning ahead. We're looking at what the world may be like. And also in this part of the brain is the capacities for logic and calculation, cleverness, okay? And so in this part of the brain, we suddenly get, as I've argued before, if the other animals could see us, we'd have to say aliens are us. We're all an alien on this planet in a lot of ways. One of the reasons is in that big consumption spree, we probably killed off 4 other types of human beings during that time. So now we seem really special because we killed off all our closest kin. But so this crystal ball that's in our head that lets us see the future is what I call a bio-powered possibility generator and a calculation machine that made us what E.O. Wilson calls the super predator on planet Earth. Now, just to be clear about Wilson here, this comes from his great book, The Social Conquest of the Earth. in which he argues that there's never been an animal that could be so cohesive as a group, in spite of all their chaos, as Homo sapiens, except for ants. And I won't go into that too much, but before Wilson got to that sociality that made us so powerful, he understood very well that it was a development of the cerebrum that gave us such tremendous power. And he gives, there's good explanations for this. Homo sapiens discovered fire by discovering fire, or they didn't discover, they used the fire. By using fire, you pre-digest your food. Our intestinal system and our stomach could shrink and our brain could grow. We had enough energy for that. We lived in nests, that is groups of people. So he has a whole series of explanations as to why we became this super predator on our planet. Now, what I want to suggest here before moving on is that I think it's that frontal lobe, the cerebrum, that is another explanation, one that I prefer to Augustine's, though we, like I said, we have them both, and that is that humans are insatiable because our desires reappear constantly in terms of future possibilities. And so we may succeed at something, and the next hour or day, we're thinking about how we could have done better. We may fail at something. We think about how we might succeed at it next time. We just can't get the future out of our present. We can hardly get the future out of our heads. And whatever the cause of that is, it's probably part of what makes us insatiable. Now, I'll give much further explanation, another thesis on that that's compatible with what I just said, but we'll see. So I'm going to turn now to what I call the symbolic transformation of the world, or many have called it that, and we'll approach it through the disciplines of psychology and anthropology for the most part. Before doing that, I'd like to give one more description of our condition. So you see, we went from the ancient world up into the 20th and 21st century. Now we're jumping back to the 1600s just for a moment, because Pascal's too good to pass by. Another Christian thinker who really understood our emptiness, and his favorite word for our frenzied life was wretchedness. Okay, and Pascal's literary images of our wretchedness are just wonderful. He saw that we constantly tended towards rampant, compulsive, and destructive activity and consumption. But just let me give you a couple of his great lines from his book, Pensée, Thoughts. He says at one point, in astonishment, this is in a section called Diversions. It's brilliant, just 2-3 pages. He says, the people that have everything, kings, he says what they will do is they will raid other castles and risk their lives trying to storm the walls and knock the walls down. And why will they do that? And his great line here, he say this in a couple places. He says, if humans could just sit quietly in their rooms, their lives would be so much better. But they can't sit quietly in their rooms, and he'll explain why. But another one he says is that humans with everything, they'll spend their whole day chasing rabbits down a hole, or chasing foxes on their horses at great expense and danger to themselves just to kill a little old fox. But my favorite is, he says, kings spend their time hitting a ball against the wall. And for Pascal, this seemed like insanity. He wasn't much of a man of action, as you might gather. But what's wonderful about that is, this rings true to me, because I spent a lot of my life hitting balls against the wall. You know, I love handball, racquetball, etc. But his claim is, his belief there is that, why do people do it? Why do kings do it? Well, if they didn't, they'd have to think about themselves. They'd have to think about their own existence and realize how finite and wretched they are. So they hired jesters to make them laugh, hit the ball against the wall, and all to escape our actual condition, our emptiness, our wretchedness. So, and he realized that boredom and even satiation quickly becomes a form of torture and misery to us. Okay, so I won't go into the descriptions of our poor plight much anymore, but I'll refer back to them. This is a brief aside. This film, if there's students out there, it's maybe before your time, Koyaanisqatsi. And I just want to put in a plug. It came out in 1982, 40 years ago this year. And Koyaanisqatsi is a Hopi term. And what it means is life out of balance. It's two other translations of that term are frenzied life and also life that calls for another way of living. And all I want to say here is, try to watch this, and the fashion will seem odd to you of the 1980s, people's hairdos and their clothing. But I tell you what, I don't think there's ever been as powerful an environmental film made, and I think it's more true now than it was in 1982. So if you watch it, try to watch it on the biggest screen you have with a good sound system. Yeah, it's on YouTube, I believe, so free of charge. Emptiness in language. Human awareness. Okay, now one more philosopher, psychologist. I bet you gotta love that name. I think it's pronounced Csikszentmihalyi. And so Csikszentmihalyi argued that human awareness doesn't have a form of its own. And again, that's that emptiness that the Buddha was the first to understand in a brilliant way. He says, human consciousness takes its form from what it focuses upon and from what it does. We become what we focus on. We become what we do. And Csikszentmihalyi, I can't go into this here. It's what was a fifth part of my paper that I don't think worked, but it's believed that this could be the key to giving us deep satisfaction in life. Maybe we'll talk about that later. So for him, well, not for him. Now I'm turning to other thinkers. Ernest Becker, most recently, Cassera earlier on. What we do somewhat uniquely is we use symbols, signs, and images to give form to that fundamental emptiness of consciousness, of human awareness. In other words, it's almost at times, this metaphor is inadequate, but it's almost like what language is hardened consciousness. Consciousness that's been reduced to maybe one thing or two or three things and turned into a sound or a mark on the page. And so in a sense, language gives form to consciousness. Signs and symbols do this in a way that we presume at one point maybe Homo sapiens didn't have that. So we talked about the cerebrum as opening us up to infinity. We've talked about God, possibly, the infinite being. There's another thing that may do that, and that is numbers. In particular, that unique type of sign, numbers. And what this means is once we start counting, of course, has no end. And this begins perhaps to open us up to the idea of infinity, or once counting leads to record keeping and money. Tied to that notion of infinity is never enough, because we can always imagine more and more and more. There's always another number. There's always another digit that we can think about. So let's try to explore this a little. Going back to Yuval Harari's great book, once again in 215, called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. And one thing that Harari notes early in the book is the first writing of which we have records is record keeping. And I think that's profoundly important, because what it's not the great literary epics that we humanists tout as the foundation of civilization. It's not the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not the Iliad, Odyssey, etc. What it is, it's counting stuff. It's records of stuff. And guess what's in those records? In our first writing, it's how much, how many, and of course, whose. Okay, Elon Musk's got a lot of stuff. Okay, so counting is I would argue the foundation of record keeping, and counting does not have an end. And now put a couple things together, counting and then money. Money is a kind of number. It's a materialized number, a symbol of wealth. And money represents things that represent value. And so suddenly, because of counting at an almost explicit level, human beings are opened up to infinity, in their everyday life. How much can I have? And if we count everything, and of course, that counting's really started intensely in the middle of the 19th century and after World War II, and in our world of constant consumerism. If that's the case, maybe there's nothing that can ever be enough, because numbers, insofar as they're represented by money, which represents values, has no end. There's nothing that's going to fill that infinite hole that Augustine talked about. So what I'd like to do here for the next couple slides is talk about not just the 1%, but you and me and how this affects us. So we've all heard about the 1%, especially since Occupy occurred. And we know roughly that the 1% of wealthiest people in the United States and the world have as much wealth as 50% of all humans on the planet. And so you're talking now, if we're 7 billion, 3.5 billion people. And so I don't know how many people are in the 1%, I guess we could figure that out. But we think of people in this context. Who do we think of? We think of Elon Musk. We think of the late Steve Jobs. We think of Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. You take your pick. And whether you might like them, you might hate them. But they, in a certain sense, represent the great heroes of our civilization and our world today. And why? Because they have so much stuff, so much money that represents value. And because of that, they must be as valuable as the guy on the street who's one of those 350 billion, okay, and that bottom 50%. Now, I don't want to pick on them. Let's pick on you and me also in this context. I want to introduce the concept here of energy slaves. And this is a concept put forward by Buckminster Fuller. And what an energy slave is, it's the amount of work one of our machines does that is equivalent to the work of one human being during some specified amount of time. Okay, there's debate about how you can look this literature up in Wikipedia where I took this from, but there's debate about how we measure it, and there's different theses about the right way to measure it, etc. But that's the basic idea. And so I want to mention to you that in 2006, the average American had 140 energy slaves working for him or her 24/7. Now, you say 24/7, well, don't forget, you got your air conditioner going, you got your refrigerator going, you probably have your electric clock going, you have all sorts of stuff going. Now, you got your slaves working for you during all day long, 147. That's a lot. By 2020, the best estimates say most Americans had between 200 and 8,000 energy slaves working for them every day. And you might think, 8,000, how could I have 8,000 energy slaves working for me? Well, some of you, if you're rich enough, you might. If you're like a professor or like the ordinary Joe, I would say some days I probably hit that 8,000 level. Probably the times I flew to Asia, the times I flew to Europe and so on. I don't know how much, but I'll bet you that put me up there, had thousands of energy slaves for that part of the trip. I had to drive there, I had to pay the ticket, etc. So you see what I'm now suggesting and trying to turn this to the problem of excess consumption is if we had 200 energy slaves or 500 or 1,000, even we people who care deeply about the earth, the planet, the future, the climate problems, and we want more, most of us, we'll do more of this, can there ever be enough? And here I think about, I was traumatized. I don't know if it was the 70s or 80s, but I was walking around, all of a sudden everybody was saying, I want it all. And when they said that, I mean, they were proud of themselves. They thought they were full of energy, and it looked kind of nice that people are enthused. But I kept walking away thinking, you want it all? Well, what would be left for me? And where would what would everybody else have? How can you have it all? And why would you want it all? But this is the world. Do they even want all the energy slaves? Man. So I just pulled this from Wikipedia too, just give you a more vivid image of this. So the item on your, I guess would be your left, would be the relationship of energy slaves to human employees in a personal intensive company. So I think about when I first started teaching philosophy, imagine there were 6 of us, and then we had that 6 may include our secretary at that time, our administrative assistant. And, we had a couple typewriters, electric typewriters, had a coffee pot. We had a mimeograph machine to show you how old I am, where we had to do like this, crank that baby around to print off these blueprints. And so, okay, we had some energy slavery going on there. Think about in a profession that's an energy intensive company. So think here about in Koyaanisqatsi, there's an image at a key transition point of that film of a fellow driving an earth mover. That's something that moves, a friend of mine tells me, without much problem, well over 100,000 tons of dirt a day with one man driving it. Well, that would be have an army of energy slaves that guy's operating with on that day. Or think of somebody using a cyclotron where they're smashing atoms. They might have who knows, 1 million energy slaves working for them. So each of us is a little red guy in some ways in this image, insofar as we're Americans in what at least once was called a first world country. Okay. Section 4, final section. Emptiness, plasticity, and the sacred canopies of culture. So we talked about the emptiness of human awareness. And what I want to suggest now, I know some of this is repeating, but oral discourse works best that way, I think. It can be neurophysiologically modeled in the plasticity of the brain. In other words, I suspect that the mind is a shadow of the brain. And in some ways, the brain may well be a shadow of the mind. But the fact that the brain, as we now understand it, is self-making. That is, the world makes it. It changes tremendously fast in the early years of our life. But we now know from research, especially in brain trauma victims, that the brain can change itself. The brain can fix itself. It's almost never done working on itself until death. Now, it does start to decay in cases like Alzheimer's and so on, but the brain's always at work on itself. And maybe this is somehow tied to this empty human awareness as well. Maybe our consciousness is a reflection of that. So the empty awareness, as we've argued already, finds its form by way of what the world gives it. Our yearning incompleteness is supplied with objects to structure it, if not fill it. And it's supplied with these objects by the culture into which we're born. Now, we know what our world gives us, and all worlds now, I think, on planet Earth, are symbols, signs, but most especially stuff. Stuff is what we want. Stuff is what overwhelms us. Now, I want to claim here, and really I'm following the anthropologist Tim Jackson, but stuff is the new sacred canopy. This term, the sacred canopy, comes from Peter Berger, sociologist, in his 1969 book of the title, The Sacred Canopy. And what the sacred canopy is, it's the fact that pretty much all humans that we know of, all human societies I know of, have all had an umbrella concept where they had some vision that the cosmos was like an umbrella of meaning over them. And their society, their culture, their values, their meanings, in a sense, were always understood in terms of this sacred canopy, this umbrella of protection and meaning and significance that really constituted their Weltanschauung, their worldview. Now, these have almost always been religions, the major religions, smaller religions. Some might say communism, though, became a sacred canopy of sorts for some people, and you can think of others. But so the anthropologists, Tim Jackson, Grant McCracken, and others have argued that the traditional role of tribe, religion, and nation in supplying a canopy of significance to us has now been replaced by the system of commodities, the system of objects. So commodities, they argue, things, are now the primary gussets in the World Wide Web of material meaning. And what that means is it's you are what you have. And every object has sort of a sense of a symbolic significance. And it's such that they call these cultural satisfiers. And these things are cultural satisfiers because they tell us who we are and how we are, if we've been successful, if we've been a failure, if we stand in good shape in society and the universe, if God loves us or not. Because the more stuff you have, the more wealth you have, the more you fit into this new sacred canopy, which guarantees that somehow you've done it right. And if you don't have much stuff, if you can't have much stuff, then something's amiss. You've perhaps gone astray. And then, so in a way, it's no surprise about the five heroes of our time I mentioned earlier, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, etc. Because God must really love these characters. I mean, look how much stuff they have. I mean, they've got so much stuff, they're selling it to us, right? So by having the sacred canopy has always protected people from emptiness and insignificance in their own lives and the ultimate scheme of things. Because it's real easy to feel anomie, or lost and empty and meaningless. But as long as you have a sacred canopy, if you can live right in terms of it, you're okay. You've got meaning, you've got significance. So I think this is the final slide here, and then we can get doing some talking on this. And so if this is right, now that the system of stuff has become the girder system of our sacred canopy, should we be surprised? I was the first time I heard it when somebody told me, Jesus wants you to be rich, Harvey. And I said, what? Jesus wants you to be rich. And then I heard about the thing called the prosperity gospel, the gospel of prosperity, that Jesus and God wanted us to be wealthy. Now, Andy, I bet can speak to this much better than me because of his wonderful little book, What Would Jesus Do? But it seems to, I don't think myself this is what Jesus would want. In fact, I'm pretty sure, unless I've been drugged my whole life when I've read biblical texts, this isn't what he wants. But anyway, I want to thank David Loy here. I'm not sure if David Loy said this or if I said it, but I know I was inspired by him. David is, I can't think of the title of his book now, but he's a Buddhist priest, I believe, but also quite a philosopher. And his book is something about lack. And well, I won't say more about it now, but it's a wonderful Buddhist text on some of the things we've been talking about here. And what I want to say is, let us not be fooled. It's no longer the case that the consumer system must be justified by linking it to sacred teachings. Maybe where we've come to at this point is the sacred teachings can now only be made legitimate by linking them to the consumer system. And that may be what's going on with the gospel of prosperity and Jesus wanting us to be rich, because and having the giant churches and all the wealth. And again, I know there's lots of representations of the great religions that don't do that, but there can be no doubt that in the United States, it seems to me that the religion has been commodified in an incredible way. But whatever the case, if it has happened in the way I'm suggesting here, then the sacred canopy is now a new one. It's made of stuff and the system of objects that we might call the Internet of Things is coming on the horizon, where all your objects will talk to each other. Your car will talk to your refrigerator and make sure it's the right temperature. Get the air conditioning before you get home. If a stranger walks up on your steps, your house will notify the police. And so this is the Internet of Things that we're starting to envision is a new kind of permeating canopy. And again, the more stuff you've got, because you're going to be the center of it, it's doing it for you, the more successful you will be as a human being, supposedly. Problem is, as we're starting to see, all in the background here, something I haven't mentioned, is the breakdown of our climate, the breakdown of our social world. And I think behind that, a whole nother set of topics, is this love of mammon. Is that what Jesus called it? The love of stuff, the love of wealth. And it may be we can't take it anymore. So in lieu of a conclusion, maybe the question is here, is there a fix to runaway consumption? Other than, for example, the one that it seems to me Bill McKibben offers, who in his incredibly good but terrifying book, Earth, Eaarth, and he titles it that because it comes out in the first paragraph or two, is because the planet we're living on now is not the planet on which life evolved. The planet we're living on, Eaarth, just to make you remember that this is not the place that brought us to life or will sustain us. And so for him, the only fix is a breakdown and collapse. And hopefully we can manage in tribes again from there. So, but thanks. I mean, that's it. And maybe we can do some questions here.
Charlie, thank you. Man, you covered so much ground there, and also entertaining along the way, and then devastating, sort of where we end up. So let me just, participants, students, if you're out there, put questions in the chat or the Q&A. And there's already one from Professor Jones, Professor Ida Jones, who teaches in our business school, by the way, teaches business ethics. And Professor Jones is asking about Buddhism, and because I think the point of the question is, she says, how does Buddhism support the idea of humans' creation as having unlimited emptiness? And you kind of mentioned that, and just isn't Buddhism maybe an alternative to this, right? You're not supposed to be greedy or consuming in Buddhism.
Indeed. And so I want to say yes and no to that question, but the way I'd say it is this. Of course, Buddhism says that we have to embrace emptiness in one sense to achieve nirvana, or what that means is freedom from desires. And so one reason I didn't talk about the Buddha too much is because it's, I think, one of the best possibilities, in a sense, to save us from these problems that I've talked about. But what emptiness means there, in my understanding of it, it's a notoriously difficult concept to understand. But the heart of Buddhism is two key elements. The doctrine of interdependent arising. Everything that comes to exist is connected to something else that exists, which is connected to something else and something else and something else. We would say everything's connected. And that's the doctrine of interdependent arising. None of us could be who we were unless we were born in a time we were born, a place, etc. And what emptiness is, the best I understand it is this, that with increased meditation, quiet time and reflection upon our world and our lives, it turns out that the borders of any concept we have, myself, the United States, whatever it may be, leads into other borders. And so I couldn't be myself without my father. I couldn't be myself without my wife or my children, etc. And so the fact that emptiness might be the realization that our concepts and words are tools that harden and reify and structure particular things. But really, if the Buddha's right and meditation's right, there are no things. Because in a sense, it all disappears. I mean, everything disappears. Everything's impermanent. Things fall apart. And if the Buddhists pull this off right, it doesn't have to be that bad, but it's, can we live with impermanence? And to do that, in a sense, it's recognizing and living with this idea of emptiness, reminding yourself that nothing is exactly what it seems to be.
So maybe I think this is interesting then. the way to deal with this infinite longing and the emptiness is to just say it's actually just true. Everything is empty, and we live in this infinite void.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
somehow then desire stops and we're no longer insatiable.
Yes, at least it ceases to torture us in the way it once did. Now, I have to confess that I've really come to appreciate Buddhism in my older years of life, my later years of life. And Nietzsche notoriously said Buddhism is a religion for old people. And what he meant by that, maybe, you often think Nietzsche's just blowing it out the side of his head. But once again, he usually turns out to be brilliant. And here I think what he may have meant is, you have to get old enough not to be totally controlled by our desires, and then suddenly you start seeing the wisdom of Buddhism. So, but the Buddha didn't think that, of course, and practitioners don't. We can condition ourselves or teach ourselves through meditation and through reflection to come to recognize that everything falls apart. Everything, it doesn't make it less. In one way, it makes it all more beautiful, but it's certainly not real if real means permanence. I mean,
let me just remind our students to put a question in the chat or the Q&A. And then let me go back, Charlie, to what you just said about age in this, because I was thinking, I think it was when you were talking about brain plasticity and the capacity of the brain to change and develop. And educators have made a lot of big deal about this, about like the growth mindset and how important it is to always be learning and lifelong learning. That could be part of the problem. We're the only creature on earth that has this really long adolescence. And then, we live for 21, 25, 30 years without knowing who we are yet, and then the rest of your life, you're just trying to recreate that sense of like, wasn't it great when I was 15 because I didn't know who I was yet? Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, indeed. I guess the saying I've heard or said is that most of us, it takes us 20 years or more to recover from our adolescence, and recover from it in the sense that there's a sense of openness and adventure that's really tremendous and wonderful there. But then we start trying. Maybe the problem is, most of us, we didn't have anything when we were teenagers. A lot of us didn't have anything, but did we worry about it? No. Somehow we were able to get into that impermanence and that flow, perhaps better than we can now. But once we get adult, once we get stabilized, suddenly, I think more and more we try to hold on to things. And maybe once we become cognizant of our future death, maybe that makes us want to hold on more and more and more.
Yeah, well, this thing about death then, too, this is another, and I think you kind of hit upon it in a couple different places, but that's the real bummer story, right? That eventually you can amass a big bank account, keep adding digits, as you said, and then you can't take it with you,
That's it. And I think for me, I think that's a really good Buddhist practice to remind oneself again and again that, there's only so much you can have, and you're going to lose it all in the end. I forget I wish I could remember his name because I want to compliment him, but a millionaire who recently, in the last about 2-3 years ago, gave away almost all of his money. Someone asked him why he gave it away. And he said, look, I can only wear one pair of pants at a time. I can only drive one car at a time. He said, I don't need that much. He said, my joy came in making money, but I realized, and so many people do, it's not to be found in having money. Because the security, that's why we often want it. And that's important, of course, up to a certain point. But you're going to lose it. You're going to die. And everyone you love is going to die. Everything's going to disappear. And we know that, whole cultures disappear. And it's sad, of course, because damn it, I want to remember the people I loved. But it doesn't, maybe, if Gustin's right, maybe we do in some other world. But if it's all based in the brain, nope, it's not going to happen. And can we embrace that transience, that impermanence that the Buddhists say is inescapable? And I
so
think
the
they're
insecurity is not, because one version of what you're saying is this is just because we lack social safety nets, and if we just had a better kind of more socialist system, we wouldn't feel so insecure. We'd only have to work 30 hours a week, and we'd have pensions at age 57. Could it be that part of the problem is the way we've structured the economy in the neoliberal West?
I think so. And so I think there's always been this element that I've mentioned as part of us. And so it's been easy for us to get sort of pulled onto this treadmill, this intensifying, never-ending treadmill. But I do indeed think that if we didn't live in terror of becoming old and not having enough to care for ourselves or care for the people we love, I don't think we'd have that. And the evidence is pretty strong in terms of the greatest happiness principle, that year after year after year, it's the Scandinavian countries that have the greatest, highest measurement of life content in its populations. And those happen to be the countries that have the highest taxation rates, almost 50%. And I know, I've been had Germanphilia much of my life. When I lived in Netherlands, I came away thinking myself, partly for those reasons, this is the best society I've been in. And it doesn't mean it's problem-free, but the absence of the terror that exists in the United States about survival, I just, didn't detect it there at that time.
Yeah, the related question, Professor Jones again says basically that capitalism tells us, instructs us, teaches us not to settle. We should always want to acquire more. And is that why, our country, we've sort of embraced the idea of emptiness. And you said that we got to have it all, just say a little bit more about capitalism, if you could.
Well, okay. So in one way, we are doing emptiness. We're making ourselves incredibly empty, but we're not embracing it explicitly because that's what we want to overcome. We want to throw enough junk into that hole that it fills it up. And so I do think if you look at the history of advertising, for example, and read some of the literature of early people in the advertising industry, it would sound these days like they were critiquing advertising, but they weren't. They were promoting it, and they were saying that we have to make people begin to have wants that they hadn't previously had. And it's really starting, I guess, in the, I think what I've been reading recently even goes back to the 1920s, where you've got some pretty powerful images and arguments about advertising. And so if you look at television ads, for example, and it seems like 90% or more, maybe almost 100%, they're fear-producing or suggesting sex and transcendence and things of that sort. But whatever it is, it's that you don't have enough. You people out there don't have enough, and here's how you can have it all. Here's how you can have it. And so, I think capitalism, maybe, and I didn't develop this in my paper, in my talk, but if we're the super predator on planet Earth, capitalism, as it exists in the United States, is the super predator on the super predator. Okay, and so we are prey of the predation of the capitalist ethos. But we're not innocent prey because, I got my share of energy slaves. We've got them right now. That's how we're doing this Zoom. Right?
Yeah. So we like it. We benefit from it, right? It creates all this wonderful stuff we've got.
And there's no doubt that it does. There's no doubt at all that capitalism is the most productive system that we've ever found. But the question is, can we keep it from sinking? I guess, as you know, over 50% of the species on our planet are now endangered. We're not sure about the insects and all. There's too many, we can't count them, but we're in big trouble, as we know, because of climate change, species extinction, etc. So we have to somehow learn to deconsume if we can.
Charlie, last question very, very quickly, and then we'll close out because we're hitting our time limit. What about hope? So two parts here. We're kind of in a predicament where we need some hope. But hope is the problem, because hope directs us to the future, like you said, right? Hope is an emptiness that's open to the future. What do you think?
Well, I guess what I would say is, again, the return to Buddhism, the kind of hope maybe would be the hope, and maybe you have to get old to feel this, but there's a certain kind of peace. When people recognize the exhaustion that trying to have everything causes, the lack of family life, the lack of friendship, the lack of community, all these things, and maybe the hope is we hope we can back off of this a little bit. Hope we can we slow down? I mean, how fast can a machine go? And maybe, as Bill McKibben suggests, maybe it has to collapse. Maybe civilization has to collapse. It sure would be nice if we find a better fix than that. That's a rotten fix, because there's going to be an untold amount of suffering as a result of that, if that's the way we get it fixed. So I agree we need hope. But again, maybe if we accept death, I mean, we're going to die anyway. We'd rather do it later rather than sooner. But I don't feel so bad for me, a little more bad for you. You're a bit younger, but our children and the young people, they don't deserve this. What's coming, I think. Sorry, I want to be a bummer, but yeah.
Well, that's true. We have to tell the truth too,
Yep, that's the job.
Yeah. Charlie, we've reached our time limit. Thank you very much. And thanks to the audience for listening. Thanks, Professor Jones, for the questions.
Thank you, Professor.
I'm going to stop recording now. Thanks again very much.
Okay.